Well, I have to say today's guest is truly a gem. Brigitte Gemme. And I just couldn't resist that little pun. But she truly is a gem because she actually comes from a place like myself where we were definitely carnivores. We loved our steak as rare. And for me, it was as raw as possible. And I look back on that now and I think, how could I have? But you don't know what you don't know. She actually started cooking plant-based in 2013 for environmental reasons. She has a PhD in education from University of Berkeley in California. Is that it?
The other
British Columbia.
British California.
Okay.
So
well,
British Columbia.
Yeah, okay. Just a few hundred miles apart or kilometers, depending on where you're from. And she's got a certificate in plant-based nutrition from the University of Winchester. She lives in Vancouver, Canada. So another Pacific Northwest person. Actually, it's Pacific Southwest for her, Pacific Northwest for me. Brigitte, it is great to have you here.
Are you ready to live the life you deserve? Do you want to feel vibrantly healthy and reach your optimal weight without dieting while being kind to animals and the planet? Then you're in the right place at the right time. Get ready to hear from doctors, nutritionists, experts, and everyday men and women committed to creating a powerful life in mind, body, and soul through ethical food choices. Welcome to Plant-Based Eating for Health with your host, certified plant-based nutritionist, Kathleen Gage.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor.
You bet. And on today's episode of the Plant-Based Eating for Health show, I really want to dig into, first of all, when did you, besides starting to cook plant-based, when did you really get that you are a plant-based eater, you're a vegan, and everything in your life changed as a result of that?
It was a slow transition for me, and often I encourage other people to take it easy because I think what happened in a way is that as I started cooking plant-based, I realized that I could cover my nutrition bases just fine. It was not my plan at all to go vegan from the beginning. I come from a long family of farmers, basically. And before I was born, my dad was still operating a dairy farm. And then when I was born, we had pigs. You know, for me, animals were never individuals. They were working animals and they were food. And as you say, I did have a thing for, I liked my steak with the blue steak with blue cheese on top. I definitely was not at all vegan. I apologize. I'm sure I have done like stupid carrot screaming jokes to people in the past. Everybody can change. I'm the living proof of that. But somewhere in 2013, I had a conversation online with someone because I was a big cycling advocate, cycling as transportation. And somebody told me, if you're fueling your bike rides with steak, well, you might as well be driving a Hummer. And that really hit me quite deep. And actually, if you look it up, it's not far off. It's not a completely inaccurate calculation. And so I was really shocked by that because I always considered myself a good green citizen, you know? Mm-hmm. And so I started researching this and I decided, well, I guess I got to take one for the team. I'm not going to forego meat entirely. If I visit people and they offer me steak, oh yeah, I'm going to eat it. But at home, I'm going to cook plant-based food only. And at the time I had a toddler, she was 18 months old. Her favorite thing to eat was lamb garam masala. So it was a transition for everybody in the family. But I started cooking a lot more beans, a lot more tofu dishes, and really expanding my repertoire as a cook as well. And it was only 2 years later when I had my second child and I was breastfeeding him, having spent a lot of time thinking about other dimensions of animal agriculture beyond the environment, thinking also about the ethics of it, that I realized that I really felt inconsistent about thinking, I don't want to treat cows. And it's not like I love cows and I want to hug cows. That's not what it is, but they're sentient beings and they certainly feel the pain that I would feel if you ripped my newborn away from me to take my milk. Like, how crazy is it that we're still doing this to this day? You know, I understand 100 years ago when we had, you know, severe challenges getting nutrition in North America, in cities, urbanization, all that. Yeah, sure. Okay. But like, that was 2015 at the time. And I decided I could not participate in that anymore. And that's when I went fully vegan for environmental reasons, for ethical reasons.
Well, and I recall reading in your book, actually, I want to mention flow in the kitchen, which we're going to definitely talk about that because I love your approach to cooking. And I have to tell you, since I've been reading your book, I have been getting so inspired and coming up with these amazing menus, and I'm not following recipes. I'm just like intuitively cooking. And I love it. I love it. But there was something in your book that, well, quite a few things in your book. I recommend that people get Flow in the Kitchen, and I'll put the link to Amazon in the show notes. But you talked about, you had that epiphany, that moment of clarity where if somebody took your baby away while you were breastfeeding just to get your milk, I mean, it was like, oh my gosh. And I think that happens to a lot of us because for me, I went plant-based in 2018 and I would not call myself a vegan. It was like that was the furthest thing from anything I wanted to be because vegans are crazy as far as I was concerned. Now my business is Vegan Visibility. I have the Vegan Visibility podcast show, the plant-based eating show. Everything is vegan now. And it happened about 6 months in where I was at the grocery store walking by the meat department, and I literally had a visceral response to looking at the meat and feeling the pain and suffering. And it sounds like that's what happened to you with your baby, which if more people could empathize with what feelings animals have when their babies are taken from them. So share with us a little bit about your transition from, okay, you started for ethical reasons, you started for the environment, and then you wrote this book. You wrote this amazing book called Flow in the Kitchen. And I really have to say I'm very impressed with it because I read a lot of books and some are really difficult to get through. Yours flows. I love that. Flow in the Kitchen flows as you're reading. So start with, kind of the whole transition from when you really started making those changes.
Yeah, for me at the beginning, at the same time I was shifting my career because I had been working in research management. You mentioned I have a PhD. I was working, supporting researchers and, helping them write grants and get the money. And my first post-PhD job, transitioning into research management, was supporting researchers in clean energy. And again, being a good green citizen, battery technology and improving the grid, carbon capture, all that good stuff. Mm-hmm. And I became so impatient with how I was writing all of this, but having read quite deeply in the topic, I realized this is not going to help us fast enough. This is not going to bring us where we need to be, anytime soon in terms of decreasing the humanity's footprint on the planet.
Right.
And I started dabbling with this idea of creating a business and how can we incentivize people to really radically make the kinds of changes that we need to do? And if you start a business, well, people will not pay you to tell them to ride their bikes to work, but they will pay you to help them with food issues, because it's such a burning problem. And at the same time, I was struggling with this too, because people think vegan eating is restrictive, but it is not. It's the opposite. My food universe was exploding with all the possibilities. And what are we going to have for dinner? And by then, I had 2 kids. My husband and I, we love, good food. What are we going to do? And I spent so much time agonizing over that decision every day, even when I still had like a day job. I spent like more than a little time in the day thinking about dinner. And that's how I started creating these systems coming from a project management background. I started creating templates to help myself first, but then I shared them with people on the internet and they were like, oh, I really want this. And so I gave them away. I call them my Mad Libs meal planner, where you can just fill in the blanks and tick a few boxes and it gives you a meal plan for the week. And it's based on this idea that you don't need a recipe. People know a lot more than they think about cooking. And when you dig, I tell you, make a stir fry. Well, you've made a lot of stir fries in your life, and maybe you were looking at a recipe like this, being very focused on that. Mm-hmm. But if you take a step back for a second, you're not in the urgency of, getting dinner on the table. And you think about it, you're like, oh yeah, I know that there's, vegetables and there's protein-rich foods like beans or tofu or something. And yeah, there's probably maybe like a grain like rice or noodles, right?
Right.
So I started playing with this idea of kind of modular cooking and how we can learn those skills so we don't constantly have to think about them. It becomes, some people talk of neural pathways. You create pathways in your brain that once you've paid attention and you've learned those things, then you can apply them in different contexts. You can use different produce, you can use different ingredients, different seasoning profiles, and so forth. So I started my business with those meal plans at the beginning, and then I started creating more complete meal plans to support people in that learning phase. But my greatest victory is when one of my clients says, I've been using the meal plans for about 6 months, and now I don't really look at your recipes anymore. I look at the ingredients and the shopping list because it saves me time, but now I know how to make soup. Like everybody knows how to make soup. It doesn't take that much thinking, once you've realized that every soup is, that's a great exaggeration, more or less the same.
But in a lot of ways they are, because I make chili soup, I make bean soup, I make rice soup, I make broccoli soup, and it's pretty much the same process. It's just different ingredients. And, which with your book, what year did you write the book?
I was just published last year, but it's really the coming together of everything I've written over the past 5 years. And I have to confess this, until July of 2022, I did not know about that idea of flow in the kitchen. It was in there through everything I had written, but it wasn't conscious of me. And then as I started reading, because a friend said, you've written so much. I've written all these blog posts. I write a pretty detailed newsletter every week. I've been doing all this information, trying to make sense of information about vegan cooking and nutrition for other people. And she said, you should put it together as a book. And so I assembled everything in kind of a table of contents that made sense. And as I was writing it, and I've also been reading a lot about Zen practice and meditation and expanding our mindfulness a little bit. And I realized the commonalities. And so really quickly, in just about 2 months last summer, I rewrote the whole thing based on what I already had, but with that twist of this idea of being more present when we cook, of being more aware of what we're doing, and above all, of doing it as a practice, meaning that we do it all the time. And having that, because if we drop out for a while, often then it's like a meditation streak. You can't say, I'm going to meditate for 3 hours, today, and it's done for the season, done for the month. It doesn't work like that. It works best when you do a little bit every day. And cooking is the same. And the great thing about cooking is that, you're going to get hungry no matter what. So your opportunity presents itself naturally.
Well, let's dig into more of what you talked about with the Zen and the meditation and all that, because what I found is, before I went plant-based, and I identify now as a plant-based, whole food plant-based vegan, and because we can fool ourselves as vegans into the fact that, we're doing something good, but we're not eating healthy. We're eating a lot of processed vegan food and things of that nature. And it's not a judgment on anybody, but it's just the reality that we live with, that food manufacturers, regardless of whether they're vegan or carnivore, they want us hooked on their food. I mean, that is a reality. And so best to get hooked on the healthy foods. But before I went plant-based, I didn't like cooking. And what I found was, once I really identified as a vegan and I thought about the animals, all of a sudden I started really loving cooking. And I realized it was an expression of love to the people that I was introducing to a different way of eating. And so with the whole Zen and the meditation of cooking, how did you really come to understand that? And for people who are somewhat resistant and they go, I have to give up so much. In reality, like you said, you're gaining so much more than you're ever going to give up. You're giving up the pain and suffering of the animals, the pain and suffering to your body energetically. And that's what I love about your book and your philosophy is, I believe that energetically, whatever we take in, it becomes a part of our DNA. It becomes a part of our reality. And that's what comes out of us too, in so many amazing ways on both sides of the spectrum. So with that in mind, talk more about the whole Zen of cooking, the meditation around cooking, and for the people who might be resistant, how they can start understanding the benefit of cooking in that way.
I come from a good old Catholic background, being
Mhm.
French Canadian, very big families. And this was not something that was very familiar to me until later in life. And my father passed away in 2020.
Mhm.
And there's health circumstances in there that I talk more about in the book. I won't go into depth into that for today, but I found in 2020 was a really terrible time. I mean, it's general, it sucks to die, but 2020 was a really bad year.
Right, right.
Couldn't be with my dad. And so there was a lot of grief that was
Mm.
hard to process. And I spent a lot of time reading Thich Nhat Hanh at that stage, No Mud, No Lotus, and thinking about this idea of interbeing a lot. And the truth is that every cell of our body, I'm looking at my hands right now, every cell of our bones, every cell in our brain, practically every piece of our body gets replaced. There's a very small number of exceptions, but every cell gets replaced. Some every 2 months, some every day, most of them every few months, few years, bones like 10 years. So we're constantly renewed. And where does the material for that building come from? It comes from the food we eat.
Right.
And so I like to think now, having been mostly, pretty much plant-based for 8 years, I like to think that everything, and actually more than that, almost 10 years now. So I like to think that everything in my body comes from plants. And I think that when we understand, as you were just mentioning, the amount of suffering that has gone in the food that we eat, if we eat meat, dairy, eggs, we realize that we become made out of that. And something I completely did not expect. As I said, I started for environmental reasons, not even for ethical reasons, but right away, I felt a relief that came from not cooking animal flesh.
Right. Right.
And I think a lot of people, when they transition, they might experience the same, and it becomes like, well, I don't want to cook it. And for a little while, when I was still having meat at home for my daughter, especially, the last thing I did, like I would buy a roasted chicken, because I didn't have to do that cooking. It really felt icky, to say nothing of like salmonella and E. coli and all the nasty stuff that's in food. And then when you're cooking those foods or you think of those as foods and you rely on them for nutrition, I think we're not really capable of understanding that we can live without them, and we can't see the suffering that's in them. But once you realized, hey, I can be completely healthy, thriving, actually, I feel better, then your mind can open to seeing the spiritual weight that's embodied in those pieces of flesh that you're cooking, right? And those animal secretions and whatnot. And then you see that, whereas previously your eyes were closed.
Right.
But then you can see how you're connected to that industry in a much more serene way, because you don't feel so hooked up on it anymore. It's not like it's accused. And then I think at that stage is a good time to become open to becoming vegan. And as you say, whole foods, plant-based vegan. Because there's the healthy part to that as well, where, I mean, I'm like you, or everybody, I don't want to accuse you, but I love a vegan donut.
I actually stay away from that because of it's a trigger for me. I've been in recovery for 39 years from drugs and alcohol, and there are certain things that I know trigger me. And so for me, my path is pretty much on the straight and narrow, and it gets narrower and deeper as I go along. And I just know certain foods. And that's why with some of the processed foods, I was doing this thing for a while where I was getting the vegan pizza. And in my mind, I knew this is not healthy for me. This is not good. And I thought, well, I'm vegan. So for a while, I quit saying I was plant-based. I just said I'm vegan. And it's amazing how we can fool ourselves in so many ways. But,
you're right. Totally.
And I want to remind people that you are listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health show. This is Kathleen Gage. I am your host, and I'm talking with Brigitte Gemme, who is the author of Flow in the Kitchen. And I want to read a line that you said here, which I think is very interesting. And why it it really popped out at me as I'll explain that. But a new runner wouldn't try to run a marathon a month after their first 5K run, not necessarily because it would be impossible to run the whole distance, 26.1 miles, but because it would be a recipe for injury and disappointment. And you talk about easing into this way of life. Now, what's interesting is when I was 61, I did my first full marathon, and I didn't train properly. And I made this announcement, I'm gonna do this marathon, come hell or high water, I'm gonna do it, blah, blah, blah. And I think I trained for like 3 months, hardly trained. And I thought, okay, I've got this thing figured out. And people were saying, you're making a mistake. And I'm like, oh, you know nothing. Well, first of all, I was the last one in. They had actually closed the gates by the time I made it in. And I was literally crawling I was just in so much pain, and I injured myself. And so you're right. For some people, it is a matter of flowing and easing into what you're doing, and really energetically looking at your reasons why. Because the big issue that you talked about that a lot of people deal with, myself included, are those family members who are not yet vegan or plant-based. And there's criticism that comes with it. There's ridicule that might come with it. There's like, are you still doing that vegan thing? And how would you share with somebody what they can do to have their family be more embracing around the choices that you're making?
Compassion is good for animals, and I think it's good for other people as well. And my husband was definitely not interested, and actually he felt very threatened when I first started cooking this way. And I remember we had a massive argument about soy sauce because I bought, and it was just an kind of an accident. I guess they didn't have soy sauce at Whole Foods that day or something. And I ended up with coconut aminos because I had read about it in a recipe, which I would never have read about if I hadn't, been reading plant-based recipes. And then my husband opens the cupboard and he's like, "You're even taking away the soy sauce?" And like, we can't have, like, this is like hippie soy sauce or something, he could recognize it was a substitute. But I think he really felt threatened. He felt at risk. My spouse is changing. What is it going to do? What is going to happen next? We're going to drift apart. Food is the thing that brings us together. I think a lot of families put a lot of value in meals together. I think that's essential. But so if you're rejecting, or if people feel rejected in the food, it can really trigger conflicts. And I think having an ear out for that when those conflicts start to arise, I wish I did. I wish I had better sense of that, because what happened to me, and I think it happens to a lot of new vegans, is that you've finally seen the light. You feel like you've opened the curtain and now you know all the things. And the irony for me is that I knew those things before because I come from a farming background, but now I knew them, and I want everybody to know. And you think that once people know, they will act accordingly, but it's more complicated than that.
Absolutely.
And I think, so I think having that compassion and knowing, and I always tell people, especially women, when they say, "Oh, my husband is not on board," I'm a sociologist by training. On average, I think it takes about 2 years. Don't quote me on this. But I've seen in a lot of relationships from people I know that when the first spouse goes vegan or, strongly plant-based kind of thing, it takes the other member of the partnership a couple years to, and so having that patience, knowing that and maybe they'll never be fully vegan, maybe they're not there in their life.
Right.
I think that would have been hard for me if my husband never, ever went there. But
so your
I
husband is 100% vegan?
Yes, absolutely. My husband is, and his concern was really around health. And he's a physician, so he had the nutritional knowledge from his medical education, which is not saying a whole lot.
Which is zero.
Exactly. And so from him, and it's also a rather conservative profession. So this kind of radical change, and I'm putting air quotes there for those who can't see, is a little scary. And especially with young children, there's so much happening in that. So having a little patience and knowing that you can do your own thing, in a progressive way. Personally, I set some boundaries, and I think that's really healthy. Once I decided I was vegan, I also did not want to cook animal foods myself. I was okay for a while with buying them for other people. And then at some point I was like, you know what, you can just buy them for yourself.
I think,
you know?
Yes, I think a lot of us go through that because it's like the first thing is the most evident, which is I'm not going to cook the meat. And then, but we still go ahead and we'll buy things at the store. And then there comes that point where we say, I'm not buying meat anymore. And it's interesting because that can go in degrees too, where there may be certain foods that you'll buy for somebody, but then you go, why am I doing this? If I'm really that committed to being vegan, why am I contributing by buying? But I know that it's a really sensitive issue for a lot of people, and it has caused, it's just like going into recovery. When one person gets sober, if both are heavy drinkers and one gets sober, the other person has to look at their own behaviors and their own actions. And when you first get sober, I remember I wanted everybody to get sober, even if they were just like normal drinkers. And, I found the solution, and I did the same thing with veganism. And yet I do know, and tell me if this has been your experience, Brigitte, that as we go along, like I've just started delving into a new level of cruelty. I started reading a book. It's called Eternal. I'm here. I've got the book right here, actually. Eternal Treblinka. And it's about the connection between animal treatment and the Holocaust. And it's a book that you can only read in degrees. I mean, I'm just like shocked at what I'm reading. And so I think that we go in degrees. So again, in your professional training, how would you recommend to spouses that they actually or just parents or with a significant other, what's the best way to help people to come on board, knowing that it's going to do better for their health, for one thing?
Right. It's sad to say, but I think most of our loved ones are not so receptive to information that comes from us.
Mm-hmm.
They will certainly learn a lot from our example. And if after 6 months, a year, 2 years, 10 years, you haven't withered away from protein deficiency, well, it seems to be working for her, and I think leading by example is key. On the other hand, they're our loved ones. They love us. And I think we underestimate the power of having a conversation with them. And the good time for that conversation is usually not at the dinner table. But it's a good opportunity to go for a walk together, a non-food context where people are not feeling hungry and threatened in what they're going to have for dinner right now. And share candidly and using the first person, I language. I am choosing to do this because of these reasons, and sharing the stories. Stories are very powerful mechanisms in our human society and not with the purpose of convincing, but with the purpose of being understood. And if there are loved ones, they probably have their concerns too about us that they can hopefully express in the first person. And if they're reacting like that, it's rarely because they want to clip our wings. It's because they're worried about us. And sometimes they can be worried because of nutrition issues. They can be worried because, maybe she's signed up for a cult or something. I think a lot of people have this very negative perception of vegans as this marginal fringe of society. So they don't know what's going on in there. So giving them a chance to express their concerns. And it doesn't mean that right away you're going to retort to them and send them all the videos, watch these 5 movies over the weekend. And then you'll figure it out. But I think giving them that space. And like I keep thinking about that guy who told me the thing about the Hummer. I did not go vegan that day. I'm quite sure the person who told me that was a vegan. I didn't go vegan that day, but I still think and reflect upon that 10 years later. And so, I mean, it had a pretty strong impact on me within a few months of that utterance. But I think the very unfortunate thing is that the animal agriculture complex, to put it in American politics term, is such a powerful force in our society. It's a powerful force the world over. There are good reasons historically why people started thinking of meat as superior nutrition, because they didn't have anything else to eat. And I can understand how in certain cultures, having access to very little nutritious food they don't think kindly of somebody
Right.
who comes to them and says, "Hey, I'll take your meat away," because
Absolutely. And I think we need to take that all into consideration, because it's kind of, it's like when somebody who's vegan, who has lived a life of privilege, and, a lot of us have lived lives of privilege, even if we're middle class, compared to people that are living in poverty and very low income areas, very minimal education, not by their choice, but by the way that society has structured it. And for example, in the United States, we have what we call redlining areas. And those are the areas that truly there are no grocery stores. There are no fresh fruits. There are a lot of bodega shopping little stores where you can go in and buy a 6-pack of beer and a pack of cigarettes easier than you can an apple. And, so when people say, oh, you just have to eat this way, it's like, well, it's not always that easy. It's not always that easy. So I want to switch gears here a little bit. And before we do, Brigitte, let people know how they can find you. What's the best web address? What's the best social media handle for them to check you out on?
Number one place to get a hold of me is veganfamilykitchen.com, veganfamilykitchen.com. There's a way there where you can download a 5-night dinner plan that reflects my general philosophy about cooking. So you can check that out and see if that is helpful to you. I try to help more people eat more plants, and I'm super welcoming. So you can always reply to any of my emails and I'll be helping you out. I'm on every other platform, social media wise, but I don't like depending on the algorithm to stay in touch with people. So definitely email is the best way to connect with me.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, I want to talk about the process of writing your book, because I have another show, Vegan Visibility, where I actually am a business consultant in the vegan space. And I work with a lot of people who want to write books. And you have done what a lot of people want to do. You have taken your philosophy around being vegan and plant-based, and you've created this amazing book where you're a wonderful storyteller, and it makes perfect sense the way you write, and it's one of those aha books where, oh yeah, that makes sense, yes, that makes sense. So when you decided to write your book, what was your process for writing, and what is your advice to those vegans who really feel like writing a book is in their cards, but they're not sure where to start?
Just like a 5K to a marathon, I think for writing a book, there's use in starting with smaller pieces first. And
I should have met you quite some time ago.
Well, so I
have done a couple of marathons, and I did a sprint triathlon, and now I stick to 5 and 10Ks. As I'm reaching 69 years old, it's like, okay, I know what my limits are.
I love it. Well, you could probably stretch it progressively, right? But I was also a writing coach a little bit when I was a grad student. So I've been through that a little bit. And I think what is key is to write little pieces and get people to read it. And that's what I've done over the past 5 years. I've written all those blog posts. I also have a channel on medium.com where I write my more exploratory out there stuff, when I'm exploring ideas. Whereas on my veganfamilykitchen.com blog, it's more in-depth information, but organized in a particular angle about cooking and nutrition. And so I wrote all of those pieces. I've had feedback from readers over the years, and I knew the whole time, roughly what my philosophy was. But I think as you write, you discover what you really want to say. Right. And when you interact with others, you also find out what they need to hear. And that was a big part of the process for me. So once I decided last year, okay, this has got to be a book. And I had been thinking about it for a little while, but it never seemed right. But I kept on writing. I was not writing the book, but I was always writing more pieces. Right. And then the first step of putting the book together was to pull every single thing I've ever written that was like over 500 words and look at everything and kind of add keywords and organize it in a bit of a tree-like structure. And then thinking, okay, this is roughly the table of contents of this. There's little things that don't really belong, and pull them out, but just rereading everything, organizing the materials. And then as I read that, the greater theme, as I just said, occurred to me, this idea of flow in the kitchen and the practice. And it seemed like everything I had thought about over the last 15 years really was coming together. And so I rewrote everything. Just, I'm a fast typist, so that's easy for me to say, but I just rewrote everything with that angle in mind. So that 80% of the material is exactly the same as it was originally, but it's put into context at the beginning and the end of chapters. with an introduction and a preface and a conclusion, bringing people into this as a story that makes sense altogether. And that was really the key for me when I worked on the title. And I'm not really good at titles. That's the hardest part for me, is putting a title on things. Oh, thank you. Well, so it was really, I sent broadcast to the subscribers of my newsletters, so a few thousand people, and said, listen, I'm struggling to find a title. Here are 10 ideas. And I put some that were really Brigitte kind of boring, like understanding vegan cooking, healthy vegan cooking, and, you know, those kinds of things. And I decided to just have some like random things that I threw in there, that I forced myself to put some out there titles so that people would have something to vote on. You know, that would, like, are they going to choose the thing that I really want, which was the boring title, or are they going to choose these out there thing? And in that process, I was like blowing in the kitchen. I was like, I never thought about that. But so that iterative process and throwing things out there to an audience, taking their feedback. I sent early chapters to a bunch of members of my audience. I said, anybody interested in reading this? And I put it as a Google Doc, and people could just type in their comments. And I was getting some feedback. I was like, yeah, that doesn't talk to me. And other people are like, yeah, this is what I've always wanted to hear. And it's funny you mentioned the marathon segment, because I've had 2 people say, I think you should take that out. A lot of people don't understand anything about running. And to me, it was the opposite. I was like, this is going to talk to exactly the people that need this. And so that's why I left them in, and I'm glad I did.
Well, I'm glad you did too, because it made perfect sense. And what's really amazing is right before your book arrived, I was starting to think about I've been thinking a lot about the energy of food and how we take in pain and suffering if we eat animal products, and how we can become more balanced. And a lot of the world problems would be solved by people going plant-based, not just the environment, but energetically, the depression, the violence, the anger. And I truly believe that. And I was thinking, you know, that needs to be my next book, is talking about the energy of food and all that. And then I get your book and I start reading it, and it's like, well, thank you, universe, for sending that to me. Now, you did say something that I want to kind of dig deeper on that. You said some of your out there ideas. I'm curious what you would consider a really out there idea. You write on, you said Medium with that. What are some of the things that may be a little out there, and yet those are the beliefs that you have, whether it be around veganism or just life in general?
Thank you so much for asking. Something that is near and dear to my heart is the issue of the connection that so few people talk about hardly anyone, between chronic disease and environmental destruction. And I will do a very quick detour by some macroeconomics here. But in our countries, in Western countries, we spent an enormous amount of money on healthcare. I've mentioned my husband is a physician, so I get a lot of I'm the manager of his clinical practice, of his medical practice. So I get all these emails from his professional associations and kind of news reviews. And there's always these articles, you know, cases of Alzheimer's will triple in the next, 50 years. And it's going to take that many more doctors and nurses. And it's going to cost all of these millions of dollars to deal with this. And then diabetes, of course, is an increasing burden of disease worldwide. And so as a society, in governments where we pay for healthcare publicly, it's even more visible. In Canada, we spend 30% of the government's budget or more on healthcare. In the US, it's done privately, but it's the same dynamics. Where do we find this money? We have to find the money by creating revenue, by doing taxation or making money, whatever, from digging the earth to create gizmos, to making big holes in the earth, defacing the planet, fossil fuel emissions, you name it, to create gizmos that people will buy to create jobs, right? Because we need economic growth. Why do we need growth? Because healthcare costs are constantly exploding. Something I haven't yet written about, but is how we're saving all that money. You know, we need to save for retirement. Why do we need to save for retirement? Because we think we're going to be sick and unhealthy in retirement, and we'll need to spend all that money for people to care for us. Well, what about we try to have fewer sick people? What about we try to enter the later years of our lives? I'm not saying eating a healthy plant-based diet is the be-all end-all of health, but it certainly is a major pillar.
Absolutely.
And so if we can do something about that, then we're doing something about chronic disease, and then we are reducing the pressure on governments and families and organizations, on everybody, to make more money all the time to pay for that healthcare.
Wow.
And so we're destroying the planet a lot less.
I need to have you back on, and we need to do a whole episode around that, because that is starting to be my next level of pulling the curtain back, because it's obscene when you really look at how hooked in people have become. There's a few good books that really address the whole addiction to foods that get us addicted to prescription drugs, that get us addicted to healthcare. And it's crazy. A couple of years ago, I actually broke my wrist. It was a freak accident, and it wasn't because my bones are brittle by any stretch of the imagination. Well, when I went to, and at the time I was 67. And so when I went to have my surgery and had to go for all my PT and everything, I was shocked at how unhealthy people are, because I live in a rural community. And honestly, since the pandemic, it hasn't been a big deal for me not to go out into the community, other than to do my grocery shopping. I like farmers markets and all that, and I'm kind of digressing here, but what I noticed was, again, how unhealthy people were, and they have given their life over to a system that really doesn't care. I mean, that is the bottom line. And I would love to have you back to really dig deep into that, because I think more people need to have that discussion. So if you're open to it, you're coming back on my show. Okay. And, I want to have one more discussion about your book because I know that, a lot of people that watch my shows and listen to them, they do want to get their book out there and they want to market it. And I want to tell you one thing you did amazingly well. When you approached me as a host, you immediately identified that you were a fit because of being vegan and plant-based. I mean, there was no question in my mind that you knew what it took to get on my show, where I get approached all the time by people that say, "Oh, I'm a nutritionist and I'd like to come and talk on your show." And I say, "Are you vegan?" "Well, no, but I can teach people stuff." It's like, no, not my market. And so what do you do? What are your top 3 things that you do to market your book and market your services that would benefit other people?
I see this as a ministry. I see this, marketing is a dirty word, but really it's about spreading the love. And when we talk about things like veganism and leaving a smaller footprint on the planet and all that, we're doing all that out of love, better health, and so it's about sharing the love. And I think that's the first step in not feeling like yucky about this. We're sharing love. That's awesome. We should do more of it. And I'm currently saying yes to anybody who wants to hear about my message that cooking is love in action. I'm reaching out to dozens of people. I've got your excellent list of podcasts also that I've been leveraging. Wonderful. And contacting people, writing to others, and always talking about this love thing. And it's hard sometimes when we choose to use the word vegan, because as you've mentioned earlier, there's a bit of a stigma. People, you were thinking that vegans were crazy, and
we are.
We see an aspect of reality that a lot of people have not considered yet. And I make it a big part of my ministry, as I said, to be welcoming of everyone, whether they are vegan today, whether they want to be vegan one day, and including people who don't ever think they will be vegan. And certainly 20 years ago, I would have told you, "Are you out of your bleeping mind?" if you told me I would be vegan. And that's fine. And I don't have further motives than that. I want to help more people eat more plants. At the end of the day, it's better for them. It's better for the planet. So just having that love and that fire and wanting to spread it is, it gets me out of bed in the morning. I wake up and I'm like, "Hey, I'm going to be on this podcast today to talk about this." And I love it when people buy the book, of course, but if they've just heard this and it stays with them, that's a start.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Well, Brigitte, this has been delightful. And I want to remind people that you've been listening to the Plant-Based Eating for Health show. This is Kathleen Gage, your host. I've been talking with Brigitte Gemme, who is the author of Flow in the Kitchen. And for those of you who are not watching this, you're listening to this, it's Flow in the Kitchen. And we'll put the link in the show notes. So Brigitte, I just want to say thank you so much for all you're doing and your ministry. I love that perspective and just the energy of food and the love of food and really being a healing force in the world. This is Kathleen Gage wishing you a great day and encouraging you. Go out and find your ministry and live a healthy life.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your commitment to an ethical life through plant-based food choices. The kind of choices that are kind to your body, the environment, and most of all, animals. Be sure to leave a review and rating of the Plant-Based Eating for Health podcast show.